Alright, we can finally begin. And by finally, I mean after a little bit of waiting on my end. Anyway, good evening, afternoon, or whatever time of day it is in your part of the world, and tonight, as you can see, the setup is a bit different. Because I've still failed to make a presentation for tonight's reading of Dictator's playbook, or rather handbook. That was up to my own personal standards, and frankly, I am behind on way too many of my own time schedules. I have no further excuses for that. So let me just put on the appropriate music, and we should continue where we left off last time. Nobody should have a problem with that. Don't think so. At about this much volume should be fine. And off we go. Chapter 4. Steal from the poor, give to the rich. Whether you are taking charge of the Ottoman Empire, a corporation, or Liberia, controlling the flow of funds is essential to buying support. However, once you've emptied the states or the corporate coffers by buying off both your essential supporters and their replacements, if necessary, you must reckon with the entirely new challenge of refilling the treasury. If a leader cannot find a reliable source of income, then it is only a matter of time until someone else will offer his supporters greater rewards than he can. Money is essential for anyone who wants to run any organization. Without their share of state's rewards, hardly anyone will stick with an incumbent for long. Liberia's Prince Johnson knew this when he tortured Samuel Doe, demanding the number on the bank accounts where the state's treasure had been hidden. Without getting his question answered, Johnson would not be able to secure power for himself. In fact, neither he nor rival insurgent Charles Taylor could secure state revenue enough to buy control of Liberia's government immediately after Doe was overthrown. The upshot? Samuel Doe died under Prince Johnson's torture without answering the question, and Liberia degenerated into civil war. Each faction was able to extract enough resources to buy support in a small region, but no one could control the state as a whole. The succession process in the Ottoman Empire is another illustration of the same point. Upon the death of their father, the Ottoman princes rushed from their provinces to secure the treasury, buy the loyalty of the army, and have all their potential rivals, also known as brothers, strangled. Whoever first secured control over the money was likely to win. If no one son triumphed, cleanly wresting the treasury out of his siblings' control, then no one could summon up the necessary revenues to pay his backers. The common result, as in Liberia, was civil war. Knowing where the money is particularly important in autocracies and particularly difficult. Such systems are shrouded in secrecy. Supporters must be paid, but there are no accurate accounts detailing stocks and flows of wealth. Of course, this lack of transparency is by design. Thus does chaotic bookkeeping become a kind of insurance policy. It becomes vastly more difficult for a rival to promise to pay supporters if he cannot match existing bribes, or for that matter, put his hands on the money. Indeed, secrecy not only provides insurance against rivals, it also keeps supporters in the dark about what other supporters are getting. Anyone who has tried to read the annual reports of publicly traded firms will quickly realize that this is a practice induced by dependence on a small winning coalition. In the corporate setting, opacity occurs despite having to satisfy strict regulations and accounting standards. Secrecy ensures that everyone gets the deal they can negotiate, not knowing how much it might cost to replace them. Thus, every supporter's price is kept as low as possible, and woe to any supporter who is discovered trying to coordinate with his fellow coalition members to raise their price. As we saw at the end of the last chapter, it is very difficult for autocrats to survive their early months in office. Good governance is a luxury they cannot afford at a time when they must scramble to find revenues. Little surprise then that we so often see looting, confiscations, extraction, and fire sales during political transitions. Or conversely, and perhaps ironically, temporary liberal reforms by would-be dictators who are mindful that it is easier for a public goods-producing Democrat than an autocrat to survive the first months in office. Yep, never ask a man his salary is HR bullshit designed to cover up pay inequalities. Indeed. Thus it is that in the immediate aftermath of a leadership transition, we see a few new leaders acting as if they care about the people, and many new leaders seizing the people's wealth and property. Such confiscations of property might well damage long-run revenue, but if a leader does not find money in the short term, then the long run is someone else's problem. Democrats are generally fortunate enough to know where most of the money is. When David Cameron became Prime Minister of Britain or Barack Obama became President of the United States, neither needed to torture their predecessor to find the money. Because democracies have well-organized and relatively transparent treasuries, their flow of funds is left undisturbed by leader turnover. There are two reasons for this transparency. First, as we're about to explore, democratic leaders best promote their survival through policies of open government. Second, a larger proportion of revenue in democracies than in autocracies tends to be from taxation of people at work. Such taxes need to be levied in a clear and transparent way because just as surely as leaders need money, their constituents want to avoid taxes. We all hate taxes and are impressively inventive in looking for ways to avoid them. Leaders, however, are rather fond of taxes, as long as they don't have to pay them. Being a dictator can be a terrific job, but it also can be terribly stressful, especially if money is in short supply. Taxes are one of the great antidotes to stress for heads of government. Taxes, after all, generate much needed revenue, which can then reward supporters. As a general principle, leaders always want to increase taxes. That gives them more resources with which to reward their backers and, not to be forgotten, themselves. Nevertheless, they will find it difficult to raise taxes with impunity. Leaders face three constraints on how much money they can skim from their subjects. First, taxes diminish how hard people work. Second, some of the tax burden inevitably will fall upon the essential backers of the leader. In general, the first constraint limits taxes in autocracies, and the second constraint sets the boundary on taxes in democracies. The third consideration is that tax collection requires both expertise and resources. The costs associated with collecting taxes limit what leaders can extract and shapes the choice of taxation methods. The first and most common complaint about taxes is that they discourage hard work, enterprise, and investment. This is true. People are unlikely to work as hard to put money in government coffers as they do to put money in their own pocket. Economists often like to express taxation and economic activity in terms of pies. When taxes are low, they say the people work hard to enlarge the pie, but the government only gets a thin slice of the pie. As the government increases taxes, its share of the pie increases, but people begin to do less work, so the overall size of the pie shrinks. If the government sets tax rates to be extremely low or extremely high, its take will approach zero. In the first case, it gets very little of a large pie. In the latter case, there is hardly any pie because hardly anyone works. Somewhere between these extremes, there is an ideal tax rate that produces the most revenue the state can get from taxation. What that ideal rate is depends on the precise size of the winning coalition. That, in fact, is one of many reasons that it is more helpful to talk about organizations in terms of how many essentials they depend on than to talk about imprecise notions such as autocracy or democracy. The general rule is that the larger the group of essentials, the lower the tax rate. Having said that, we return to the less precise vocabulary of autocracy and democracy, but always be mindful that we really mean smaller or bigger coalitions. Autocrats aim for the rate that maximizes revenue. They want as much money as possible for themselves and their cronies. In contrast, good governance dictates that taxes should only be taken to pay for things that the market is poor at providing, such as national defense and large infrastructure projects. Taking relatively little in exchange in taxes therefore encourages the people to lead more productive lives, creating a bigger pie. Democrats are closer to this good governance ideal than autocrats, but they too overtax. The centerpiece of Reaganomics, the economic plan of US President Ronald Reagan, was that US taxes were actually higher than this revenue-maximizing level. By reducing taxes, he argued people would do so much extra work that government revenue would actually go up. That is, a smaller share of a bigger pie would be larger than the bigger share of a smaller pie. Such a win-win policy proved popular, which is why similar appeals are again in vogue. Of course, it did not quite work out this way, in fact. To a certain extent, Reagan was right. Lower taxes encouraged people to work, and so the pie grew. However, crucially, in democracies, it is the coalition's willingness to bear taxes that is the true constraint on the tax level. Since taxes had not been so high as to squash entrepreneurial zeal in the first place, there wasn't much appreciable change as a result of Reagan's tax cuts. The pie grew a little, but not by so much that revenues went up. Today, the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party seeks to reenact tax-cutting policies similar to Reagan's. Like him, they argue that tax cuts will grow the economy. The lesson from the Tea Party movement's electoral success in 2010 is that people don't like paying taxes. Politicians who raises or even maintains current taxes are politically vulnerable, but then so too are politicians who fail to deliver the policies their coalition wants. Herein lies the rub. It may well be that cutting taxes while increasing the size of the economic pie fails to make it big enough to generate both more wealth and more effective government policies. The question is, and always must be, the degree to which the private sector's efficient but unequal distribution of wealth trumps government's more equitable, less efficient but popular economic programs. Ruling is about staying in power, not about good governance. To this end, leaders buy support by rewarding their essential backers relative to others. Taxation plays a dual role in generating this kind of loyalty. First, it provides leaders with the resources to enrich their most essential supporters. Second, it reduces the welfare of those outside of the coalition. Taxation, especially in small coalition settings, redistributes from those outside the coalition, that is the poor, to those inside the coalition, that is the rich. Small coalition systems amply demonstrate this principle, for these are places where people are rich precisely because they are in the winning coalition, and others are poor precisely because they're not. Philip Chiangwa, a protege of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, has stated it bluntly. I am rich because I belong to ZANU-PF, Mugabe's ruling party. When the coalition changes, so does who is rich and who is poor. We'll prefer the term trickle-down economics here. Nor is Zimbabwe an isolated case. Robert Bates, a professor of government at Harvard University, described the link between wealth and political backing in Kenya. I recall working in Western Kenya shortly after Daniel Arap Moi succeeded Jomo Kenyatta as president of Kenya. With a shift in power, the political fortunes of elite politicians had changed. As I drove through the highlands, I encountered boldly lettered signs posted on the gateways of farms announcing the auction of cattle, farm machinery, and buildings and lands. Once they were no longer in favor, politicians found their loans cancelled or called in, their subsidies withdrawn, or their lines of business, which had once been sheltered by the state, exposed to competition. Some whom I had once seen in the hotels of Nairobi looking sleek and satisfied, I'd have encountered in rural bars looking lean and apprehensive as they contemplated the magnitude of their reversal. Needless to say, people want to be sleek and satisfied and not lean and apprehensive. That is why they remain loyal. A heavy tax burden emphasizes the difference between being rich and poor, in or out of the coalition. At the same time, the resulting revenues fund spoils for the lucky few, leaving little for everyone else. Further, the misery such heavy taxes inflict on the general population makes participation in the common coalition even more valuable. Fearing exclusion and poverty under an alternative leadership, supporters are all the more fiercely loyal. They will do anything to keep what they have and keep on collecting goodies. Gerard Padro y Miguel of the London School of Economics has shown that the leaders of numerous African nations tax too highly, that is, beyond the maximum revenue point, and then turn around and provide subsidies to chosen groups. This may be economic madness, but it is also political genius. Democrats tax heavily too, and for the same reason as autocrats. They provide subsidies to the groups that favor them at the polls at the expense of those who oppose them. We will see, for instance, that Democrats and Republicans each use taxation when they can to redistribute wealth from their opponents to their supporters. So democratic governments also have an appetite for taxation, but they cannot indulge that appetite to the extent autocrats can. Since their numbers are small, an autocrat can easily compensate his essential backers for the tax burden that falls on them. This option is not available to a Democrat because his number of supporters is so large. Tax rates are therefore limited by the need to make coalition members better off than they can expect to be under alternative leadership. On the campaign trail, US President George H.W. Bush told the American people, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Yet, budget shortfalls left him scrambling for revenue. The result was more taxes. In the wake of the first Gulf War just 18 months earlier, Bush had approval ratings of over 90%. But a declining economy and his broken promise on taxes led to his ouster in the 1992 election. While all leaders want to generate revenue with which to reward supporters, Democratic incumbents are constrained to keep taxes relatively low. A Democrat raises taxes above the good governance minimum, but he does not raise taxes to the autocrat's revenue maximization point. The relationship between regime type and taxation can be seen in the recent history of Mexico. Mexico's first free election came in 1994, and the incumbent party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, lost nationally for the first time in 2000. As can be seen in the figure down below, onset of competitive elections and of democratization marks the start of the decline in government revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product. As the size of the winning coalition enlarged, Mexico's tax rates followed suit by declining, just as they should when politicians need to curry favor with many instead of a few. For instance, the highest marginal tax rate in Mexico in 1979, with the PRI firmly in control, was 55%. As the PRI's one-party rule declined, so did tax rates. By 2000, marking the first truly free, competitive presidential election, Mexico's highest tax rate was 40%. Members of any autocrat's small coalition also dislike paying taxes, but they readily endorse high taxes when those taxes are used to funnel great wealth back to them. This was just the case in Bell, California. City manager Robert Rizzo raised property taxes. The city council could have stopped such increases, but had they done so, the city could not have afforded their bloated consultancy fees. Suppose for simplicity that Rizzo's coalition was composed of 1% of Bell's 36,000 residents. For every dollar increase in tax per person, Rizzo would have had up to $100 of services and payments he could transfer to each coalition member. Had his coalition been composed of half of Bell's residents, each dollar increase in tax would only provide $2 per coalition member for transfers and services. It's easy to see why the coalition would sooner endorse higher taxes in the former setup than the latter. And here's the figure I mentioned, Mexico's tax rate and democratization. See, the more democratic, the lower the taxes. Nevertheless, to most of us who live in democracies, the idea that our taxes are actually less than in other systems might sound frankly absurd. If you live in New York City, as we do, you pay federal tax and local taxes, as well as Social Security, Medicare, and sales tax. If you earn a reasonably good income, then income taxes suck up about 40% of your earnings. By the time you factor in sales, property, and other taxes, a reasonably wealthy New Yorker will have paid more than half her income in tax. Hardly a low figure. European democracies, with their extensive social safety nets and universal health care, can tax at even higher rates. In contrast, some autocracies don't even have income taxes, but the comparison of average tax rates is misleading. At the income levels taxed in much of the world's poor autocracies, the tax rate in Europe and the United States is zero. We have to compare taxes at given income levels, not across the board, since most income tax systems are designed to be progressive, taxing higher incomes at higher rates than lower incomes. By looking at how much tax has to be paid at a given income level across countries, we get close to comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. In the United States, for example, a couple with one child and an income under about $32,400 pays no income tax. If their income were, say, $20,000, they would receive $1,000 from the federal government to help support their child. In China, a family with an income of $32,400 is expected to pay about $6,725 in income tax. Further, even when nominal rates are low, autocracies have high implicit taxes. If you have something valuable, then it simply gets taken. It's worth remembering that the wealthiest man in China and the wealthiest man in Russia are both currently in prison. In 2004, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the wealthiest man in Russia and the 16th wealthiest man in the world. He made his money building up Yukos, an oil company founded in the privatization wave in Russia in 1993. Yukos was the largest non-state oil company in the world and accounted for about 20% of Russian oil production. Khodorkovsky, who had initially been close to the government, spoke out about Putin's autocratic rule of Russia and he funded several opposition political parties. In 2003, he was arrested on fraud charges and subsequently convicted. The Russian government accused Yukos of tax evasion. According to Yukos, the tax take claimed by Russia from Yukos was substantially higher than that levied on other oil companies, and in some years exceeded gross revenue. These enormous tax burdens forced Yukos into bankruptcy. With the end of his first 8-year sentence, Khodorkovsky, apparently still seen as a liability by the Russian government, was recently given a second sentence for embezzlement and money laundering. If memory serves right, he's been released about a year or two ago, by this point in time. But moving on. His Chinese counterpart, Huan Guanyu, also known as Wang Quan-ku, fared little better. Starting with nothing but $500 in a street cart, Guanyu created Gome, the largest electrical retailer in China. No, from a prison. He was repeatedly ranked as China's richest individual, until he was sentenced to 14 years in prison for bribery. It is likely that he was guilty since bribery is commonplace in Chinese business dealings. It is also likely that he and others who have been prosecuted for corruption in China were chosen for political reasons. In autocracies, it is unwise to be rich unless it is the government that made you rich. And if this is the case, it is important to be loyal beyond all else. As we noted, it is possible that Guanyu and Khodorkovsky were both guilty of fraud and bribery. That is the nature of business in their respective countries. Even so, many others were surely guilty of the same crimes and yet walk free today. What singled them out was that they did not support the government and they had enormous wealth. White farmers in Zimbabwe suffer a similar fate. Robert Mugabe's government seizes their land. The cover for these seizures is land redistribution to poor blacks who were dispossessed under colonial and white minority rule. The reality is much different. The land invariably ends up in the hands of cronies, not of former farmers. When the new owners invariably allow the land to fall into disuse, the farmers lose their investments, farm workers are evicted from their houses, and Zimbabwe, once a huge agricultural exporter, becomes hungrier. But on the other side of the ledger, Robert Mugabe is still in power. Well, not yet. Or rather, not anymore, as of the time of this stream. Democrats are less inclined to rewrite the rules and seize wealth. Tempting though extra revenue is, it comes at the cost of lost productivity to the masses. In Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, the heroine, Portia, disguises herself as a judge and adjudicates at the trial between Antonio, who pledged his person as a security on a loan, and Shylock, who demands his pound of Antonio's flesh when Antonio does not pay in time. Bassanio, Antonio's friend and Portia's husband, offers to pay many times the debt due, and when Shylock refuses, he appeals to the mercy of the court. And I beseech you, rest once the law to your authority, to do a great right, do a little wrong. But Portia recognizes the sanctity of the law. It must not be. There is no power in Venice can alter a decree established. 'Twill be recorded for a precedent, and many an error by the same example will rush into the state. It cannot be. The many messages of the Merchant of Venice are complicated and controversial, but one message, epitomized by the passage just quoted, but not the reversal in the enforcement of contracts just a bit later in the play, reminds us that rule of law is essential to successful commerce. As one examination of the demands of commerce, as seen in the Merchant of Venice, makes clear both for Venice and in general, contract does not require friendship, but it does require a degree of trust that the market is well regulated, or that the institutions of contract enforcement are appropriately strong. Democrats need resources so they can reward their coalition, but they can't take too much or they risk alienating those very same supporters. Similar concerns shape how taxes are collected. Leaders want to collect taxes on a fair or at least transparent way. Few US citizens would regard the Internal Revenue Service, that is IRS, as a transparent tax authority, but it is at least governed by rules, albeit with an awful lot of them, and enforced by an independent judiciary. As for all the rules and exceptions that make the US tax code so complicated, these inevitably result from politicians doing what politicians inevitably do, rewarding their supporters at the expense of everybody else. This is why sheaves of pages in the tax code are dedicated to farmers, a crucial coalition for some politicians who need to receive their rewards if their senators and representatives are to remain in power. Autocrats can be less transparent. As we saw in the case of unfortunate Messieurs Khodorkovsky and Guanyu, when the opportunity arises, autocrats will grab whatever they can. Yet even as they work without the constraint of being bound by people's feelings, autocrats face real issues in the realm of collecting taxes. High taxes will inevitably drive people to hide their work and profits. This makes monitoring their income difficult. Furthermore, the large bureaucracy required to run a comprehensive tax system, such as the one in the United States, can be prohibitively expensive. To put this in context, the US's Internal Revenue Service spends about $38 per person, or about 0.5% of the IRS take, on collecting an average of $7,614 in tax per person. This is fine in a nation with a capita of GDP of $46,000, but in nations with incomes of only $1,000 per year, such a cost of collecting taxes would be about 23% of the revenue. Further, setting up a large bureaucracy makes an autocrat beholden to those who run it. The first rule of office holding is to minimize the number of people whose support you need. To avoid becoming a slave of their own tax collectors, autocrats often use indirect taxation instead. With indirect taxes, the cost of the tax is passed on to someone other than the person actually paying it. For instance, sellers pay sales taxes to municipal governments, but sellers pass the cost on to buyers, making sales taxes indirect. Agricultural marketing boards are a common indirect means of taxing poor farmers in autocracies. In principle, such organizations are designed to fulfill a similar function as the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, CAP. The CAP guarantees farmers minimum prices for their goods, thus it provides a benefit to the farmers. In many democracies, as in the United States, rural areas are overrepresented electorally. Given the desire to rule with as few supporters as possible, it should be of little surprise that Democrats often include farm groups in their coalition and reward them accordingly. In contrast, farmers are rarely key supporters in autocracies. Farm marketing boards are set up to exploit rather than help them. Consider Ghana's Cocoa Marketing Board, CMB. Cocoa is Ghana's major agricultural export. The CMB fixes a price for cocoa, an implicit tax, and insists that farmers sell all their cocoa to the board at that price, an indirect tax. The board then resells the cocoa on the world market at a higher price and pockets the difference. The first rung of in the long ladder of leeches that feed on the sweat of the cocoa farmers is the Cocoa Marketing Board. These rents have been a major source of government revenue in Ghana. Taxing the poor to pay the rich has plenty of bad economic consequences, but these tend to be in the long run, that is, on another leader's watch. For instance, in Ghana, heavily taxing farmers had the longer-term consequence of reducing crops. Ghanaian farmers simply stopped planting and caring for cocoa trees. By 1980s, cocoa production had collapsed and farmers tried to smuggle what little they did grow to neighboring Côte d'Ivoire. Case after case proves the point. When taxes are too high, then people either stop working or they find ways to avoid the formal economy. Unless they heard about American farmers, apparently the entirety or almost all of the farmers that were growing soybeans in America were on government subsidies. Make of that what you will. When even indirect taxation proves to be too much trouble, autocrats sometimes turn to outsiders to help extracting funds from their people. For autocrats and their tax collectors, this has a virtue and a liability. People hired to extract money for the government, keeping a portion of what they collect for themselves, have a strong incentive to take in lots of tax revenue. That's good for them and good for the leader who receives the substantial remainder not kept by prudent tax collectors. But people hired to extract money can also use the power of that money to become a threat to a leader, and that of course is dangerous for them and for the incumbent. The Caliphate was the Muslim empire created by military conquest following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. It ruled much of the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe until 1258. In the tradition of the Romans before them, the caliphs avoided the technical difficulties of tax collection by outsourcing the task altogether. A tax farmer would pay the treasury for the right to collect taxes from a particular territory. Obviously, once they had paid for the privilege, tax farmers extracted everything they could. They were notoriously brutal and always looking for ingenious ways to take more. For instance, they would demand payment in silver coins rather than crops and then collude with merchants to fix prices. Those who could not pay were punished or even killed. Naturally, the people resisted. Tax farmers contended with the persistent problem of people fleeing the land rather than paying their property taxes. To prevent this, tax farmers set up patrols to check identities. Non-Muslims were often tattooed or forced to wear dog tags with their name and address to prevent them from fleeing. Initially, some of the tax collected by the tax farmers was only applicable to non-Muslims. This proved to be a very successful, if not wholly intended, means of encouraging religious conversion. It seems that many non-Muslims, realizing that they could reduce the tax collectors' reach by becoming Muslim, put their religious beliefs aside and converted. As long as these conversions did not assume massive proportions, the tax farmers made themselves incredibly rich at the expense of the average citizen. When conversion became commonplace, tax farmers adjusted, no longer excluding Muslims from some of the taxes they levied. and from the perspective of the caliph, they ensured reliable revenue. That they terrorized the people that was of no political importance. Impoverished and persecuted farmers were not part of the winning coalition. Autocrats can avoid the technical difficulties of gathering and redistributing wealth by authorizing their supporters to reward themselves directly. For many leaders, corruption is not something bad that needs to be eliminated. Rather, it is an essential political tool. Leaders implicitly, or sometimes even explicitly, condone corruption. Effectively, they license the right to extract bribes from the citizens. This avoids the administrative headache of organizing taxation and transferring the funds to supporters. Saddam Hussein's sons were notorious for smuggling during the 1990s when Iraq was subject to sanctions. They made a fortune from the sanctions that were supposed to harm the regime. Oil is the devil's excrement, at least according to Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, a Venezuelan who founded the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing nations. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you will see, oil will bring us ruin. And he was right. As many leaders have learned, the problem with raising revenue through taxation is that it requires people to work. Tax too aggressively or fail to provide an environment conducive to economic activity, and people simply don't produce. Actually extracting revenue from the land itself provides a convenient alternative, cutting the people out of the equation altogether. Take oil, for example. It flows out of the ground whether it is taxed at 0% or 100%. Labor represents but a small part of the value of oil extraction. This makes it a leader's dream and the people's nightmare. In a phenomenon often called the resource curse, nations with readily extractable natural resources systematically underperform nations without such resources. Resource-rich nations have worse economic growth, are more prone to civil wars, and become more autocratic than their resource-poor counterparts. Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa, achieved independence from Britain in 1960. At the time of independence, it was a poor nation, but expectations were high. These expectations grew with the discovery of oil. Nigeria is believed to have the world's 10th largest reserves. With a rise in oil prices during the oil crises in the early and late 1970s, Nigeria found itself awash with funds. And yet, by early 1980s, the country was swamped by debt and poverty. From 1970 to 2000, Nigeria had accumulated over $350 billion in oil revenue. It has not helped the people. Over the same years, average annual income per capita went from US $1,113 in 1970 to $1,084 in 2000, making Nigeria one of the poorest nations in the world, in spite of its vast oil wealth. Poverty has risen too. $1 per day is a common standard used for assessing poverty. In 1970, 36% of Nigerians lived on less. By 2000, this figure had jumped to nearly 70%. The situation can hardly be said to have improved since then. Even with today's inflated dollars, a majority of Nigerians earn less than $1 a day, and per capita income has continued to fall. Adjusted for inflation, income is below what it was when Nigeria became independent. Nigeria is not exceptional. The figure below shows exactly that. The horizontal axis shows natural resource exports as a percentage of GDP in 1970. The vertical axis shows the average level of economic growth between 1970 and 1990. The trend is clear. Nations flush with oil, copper, gold, diamond, or other minerals grow more slowly. Nevertheless, natural resources are wonderful for leaders. Unlike getting their subjects to work, leaders don't have to encourage natural resources to work. Admittedly, the minerals need to be extracted, but by and large, autocrats can achieve this without the participation of the local population. In Nigeria, for instance, the oil is concentrated in the Niger Delta region. Foreign firms with foreign workers do most of the extraction. Few Nigerians participate. The oil companies run security firms, effectively small private armies, to keep the locals from obstructing the business or complaining about the environmental degradation that results. BP and other foreign firms are free to act with impunity, provided they deliver royalty checks to the government. This is not so much a failing of these companies as the way business must be conducted in countries whose leaders rely on a few cronies to back them up. A company that acts responsibly will necessarily have less money to deliver to the government, and that will be enough for them to be replaced by another company that is willing to be more cooperative. One interesting manifestation of the differences between wealth and poverty in resource-rich lands is the cost of living for expatriates living in these countries. While it is tempting to think that cities like Oslo, Tokyo, or London would top the list as the most expensive places, they don't. Instead, it is Luanda, the capital of the southwestern African state of Angola. It can cost upward of $10,000 per month for housing in a reasonable neighborhood, and even then water and electricity are intermittent. What makes this so shocking is the surrounding poverty. According to the United Nations Development Programme, 68% of Angola's population lives below the poverty line, more than a quarter of children die before their 5th birthday, and male life expectancy is below 45 years. The most recent year for which big income inequality data are available is 2000. These data suggest that the poorest 20% of the population have only 2% of the wealth. Angola is ranked 143 out of 182 nations in terms of overall human development. Prices in Angola, as in many other West African states, are fueled by oil. The resource curse enables autocrats to massively reward their supporters and accumulate enormous wealth. This drives prices to the stratospheric heights seen in Luanda, where wealthy expatriates and lucky coalition members can have foie gras flown in from France every day. Yet to make sure the people cannot coordinate, rebel, and take control of the state, leaders endeavor to keep those outside the coalition poor, ignorant, and unorganized. It is ironic that while oil revenues provide the resources to fix societal problems, it creates political incentives to make them far worse. This effect is much less pernicious in democracies. The trouble is that once a state profits from mineral wealth, it is unlikely to democratize. The easiest way to incentivize the leader to liberalize policy is to force him to rely on tax revenue to generate funds. Once this happens, the incumbent can no longer suppress the population because the people won't work if he does. The upshot is that the resource curse can be lifted. If aid organizations want to help people in oil-rich nations, then the logic of our survival-based argument suggests they would achieve more by spending their donations lobbying the governments in the developed world to increase the tax on petroleum than by providing assistance overseas. By raising the price of oil and gas, such taxes would reduce worldwide demand for oil. This in turn would reduce oil revenues and make leaders more reliant on taxation. Effective taxation requires that the people are motivated to work, but people cannot produce as effectively if they are forbidden with such freedoms as freedom to assemble with their fellow workers and free speech, with which to think about, among other things, how to make the workplace perform more effectively, and how to make government regulation less of a burden on the workers. Borrowing is a wonderful thing for leaders. They get to spend the money to make their supporters happy, and if they're sensible, set some aside for themselves. Unless they're fortunate enough to survive in office for a really long time, repaying today's loan will be another leader's problem. Autocratic leaders borrow as much as they can, and democratic leaders are enthusiastic borrowers as well. We are all at least a little bit impatient. It's in our nature to buy things today when better financial acumen might suggest saving our money. Politics makes financial decision-making even more suspect. To understand the logic and see why politicians are profligate borrowers, suppose everyone in a country earns $100 per year and is expected to do so in the future too. The more we spend today, the more we must pay in interest and debt repayment tomorrow. Suppose, for instance, that to spend an extra $100 today, we have to give up $10 per year as interest payments in the future. It is reasonable to see that people could differ on whether this is a good idea or not, but politics certainly makes it more attractive. To simplify the issue vastly, suppose leaders simply divide the money they borrow among the members of their coalition. This encourages leaders to borrow more. If a leader has a coalition of half the people, and he borrows an amount equivalent to $100 per person, then everyone has to give up $10 in each future year, as taxes to pay the interest. However, since the coalition is only half the population, each coalition member's immediate benefit from the borrowing is $200. While to some this might still not seem like an attractive deal, it is certainly better than incurring the same debt obligation for $100. Governments of all flavors are more profligate spenders and borrowers than the citizens they rule, and that profligacy is greatly multiplied when we look at small coalition regimes. As the size of the coalition shrinks, the benefits that the coalition gains from indebtedness go up. If, for instance, the coalition includes one person per 100, then in exchange for the debt obligation, each coalition member receives $10,000 today instead of the mere $200 in the 50% coalition example. This is surely a deal that most of us would jump at. As the coalition size becomes smaller, the incentive to borrow increases. Of course, borrowing more today means higher indebtedness and a smaller ability to borrow tomorrow, but such arguments are rarely persuasive to a leader. If he takes a financially reasonable position by refusing to incur debt, then he has less to spend on rewards. No such problem will arise for a challenger who offers to take on such debt in exchange for support from members of the current incumbent's coalition. This makes the current leader vulnerable. Incurring debt today is attractive because, after all, the debt will be inherited by the next administration. That way, it also ties the hands of any future challenger. A leader should borrow as much as the coalition will endorse and markets will provide. There is surely a challenger out there who will borrow this much and, in doing so, use the money to grab power away from the incumbent. So not borrowing jeopardizes a leader's hold on power. Heavy borrowing is a feature of small coalition settings. It is not the result, as some economists argue, of ignorance of basic economics by third world leaders. In an autocracy, the small size of the coalition means that leaders are virtually always willing to take on more debt. The only effective limit on how much autocrats borrow is how much people are willing to lend them. Earlier we saw the paradoxical result that as Nigeria's oil revenues grew, so did its debt. It wasn't that the oil itself encouraged borrowing. Autocrats always want to borrow more. Rather, revenues from oil meant that Nigeria could service a larger debt, and so people were more willing to lend. Although a large coalition size in a democracy places some restrictions on the level of borrowing, democratic leaders are still inclined to be financially irresponsible. Remember, while the debt is paid by all, the benefits disproportionately flow to coalition members. Over the last 10 years, the economies of many Western nations boomed. This would have been a perfect time to reduce debt. Yet in many cases, this did not happen. In 1990, US debt was $2.41 trillion, which was equivalent to 42% of GDP. By 2000, this debt had grown in nominal terms to $3.41 trillion, although in relative terms this was a decline to 35.1% of GDP. However, as the economy prospered during the 2000s, debt continued to slowly accumulate instead of shrink. In 2007, before the financial crisis, US debt stood at $5.04 trillion, or 36.9% of GDP. A bigger economy means a greater ability to service debt and a capacity to borrow more. We may be inclined to explain the expansion of the debt by citing the party politics of the leader, for example. However, ideology offers a poor account of these trends. The major accumulations of US debt in the post-war period both began under Republican administrations, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. This debt grew at a staggering pace during the 2007-2010 recession as the United States underwrote troubled banks and embarked on Keynesian policies of fiscal stimulus. By the third quarter of 2010, debt was $9.13 trillion, or 62% of GDP. British debt follows a similar pattern. In 2002, debt stood at 29% of GDP, but by 2007 it was 37%, and this had exploded in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis to 71% of GDP. From a Keynesian perspective, many of the governments are taking the perverse steps of trying to cut spending during a recession instead of stimulating demand. This does not reflect a desire by politicians to borrow less. Rather, debt crises in Iceland, Greece, and Ireland have led many investors to doubt the ability of nations to repay. This has pushed up the cost of borrowing and made it much harder to secure new loans. It is supply, not demand, that has shrunk. Markets limit how much a nation can borrow. If individuals borrow too much and either cannot or will not repay it, then banks and other creditors can seize assets to recover the debt. With sovereign lending to countries, however, creditors cannot repossess property. On a few occasions, creditors have tried. For instance, France invaded Mexico in 1862 in an attempt to get Mexico to repay loans. France also invaded the Ruhr, an industrial area of Germany, in 1923 in order to collect reparation payments due from World War I that Germany had not paid. Both attempts failed. In practice, the only leverage lenders have over nations is to cut them off from future credit. Nevertheless, this has a profound effect, as the ability to engage in borrowing in financial markets is valuable. For this reason, nations generally pay their debt. However, Once the value of access to credit is worth less than the cost of servicing the debt, then leaders should default. If they don't, then surely a challenger will come along who will offer to do so. This was one of the appeals of Adolf Hitler to the German people in 1930s. Germany faced a huge debt, in part to pay reparations from World War I. Hitler defaulted on this debt. It was a popular policy with the German people since the cost of servicing the debt was so high. As debt approaches the balance point where the value of access to credit equals the cost of debt service, lenders refuse to increase the overall size of debt. At this point, if leaders want to borrow more, then they need to increase revenues such that they could service this additional debt. As in the Nigerian case, the discovery of exploitable natural resources provides one means to increase debt service and hence more borrowing. However, without such discoveries, the only way to increase borrowing is to increase tax revenue. For autocratic leaders, this means liberalizing their policies to encourage people to work harder because they already tax at a high implicit rate. Only when facing financial problems are leaders willing to even consider undertaking such politically risky liberalization. They don't do it frequently or happily. They liberalize, opening the door to a more democratic, representative, and accountable government only when they have no other path to save themselves from being deposed today. Debt forgiveness is a popular policy, but one that is generally misguided. Those in favor of forgiving the debt of highly indebted poor countries argue that the debt burden falls on the poor people of the nation who did not benefit in a consequential way from the borrowed funds. This is certainly true. As we have explained, the benefits to go to the leader and the coalition while the debt obligation falls on everyone. But people who argue for debt forgiveness construct their arguments in terms of how they think the world should operate, rather than how it actually works. In late 1980s, as many poor nations struggled to repay debts, creditors coordinated to reschedule and forgive debt. The French Ministry of the Economy, Finance and Industry became an important center for negotiations, helping ensure that creditors shared similar losses. These meetings became known as the Paris Club. In 1996, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank launched the Heavily Indebted Poor Country, HIPC, initiative. Instead of the previous case-by-case approach, this program provided systematic help to poor nations with writing down their debts. However, nations could only receive debt relief when they passed or made substantial progress towards meeting explicit criteria concerned with poverty alleviation and budget reform. The program received a huge boost under the Millennium Goals program. From 2006 onwards, many HIPCs saw very large reductions in their debt. We will have to wait to see the consequences of these programs. However, it is useful to look back at some of the largest debt relief efforts prior to 2000. It is particularly illustrative to observe how important the nature of governance is. Even though creditors carefully chose those nations that they thought would behave sensibly, in the wake of debt relief, many nations started increasing debt again. As a percentage of debt, the largest debt reliefs prior to 2000 were given to Ethiopia in 1999, 42% of debt, Yemen in 1997, 34%, Belarus in 1996, 33%, Angola in 1996, 33%, Nicaragua in 1996, 30%, and Mozambique in 1990, 27%. With the exceptions of Angola and Nicaragua, each of these nations promptly started reaccumulating debt. For instance, after a series of small debt reductions in 1999, with a forgiveness of $4.4 billion, Ethiopia had its debt reduced to $5.7 billion. But by 2003, this debt had risen to $6.9 billion. Despite the forgiveness of $589 million of debt in 1996, Belarus's debt had steadily risen from $1.8 billion in 1995 to over $4.1 billion in 2005. Even though debt reduction programs vet candidates, these examples suggest that in many cases, forgiveness without institutional reform simply allows leaders to start borrowing again. Let's see here. Give me a moment to put on another playlist. Yeah, I think this one will work. I hope I won't get DMCA'd. Democrats also like to borrow, but they are not as profligate as autocrats. They prefer lower levels of indebtedness than autocrats. Democratization promotes successful debt reduction, as the history of Mozambique and Nicaragua illustrate. In 1990, 27% of Mozambique's debt was forgiven. The result was the further accumulation of debt. By the time Mozambique democratized in 1994, debt was over $8 billion. However, this debt was gradually reduced, as seen in this slide, aided in part by further forgiveness. But fine, you are right. Let's put on something else. I think a little bit of this one will work just as well. And then where was I? Right. The HIPC program has received much criticism for its slow pace in reducing the debt of poor nations. Our criticism of HIPC is the opposite. These programs are actually too eager to forgive debt. Debt forgiveness simply allows autocratic leaders to start borrowing more money. As we'll see a little later, financial crises are one of the important reasons leaders are compelled to democratize. Debt reduction, however, relieves financial pressure and enables autocrats to stay in office without reform, continuing to make the lives of their subjects miserable. It is no wonder that autocrats love debt relief. But how does debt relief work to those who would like to improve governance and who want to start, as we do, from understanding how leaders behave rather than engaging in wishful thinking? We depart for the moment from looking at governance through a leader's eyes and instead turn our attention to how to change an autocrat's vision. That is, we turn for the moment to thinking about how we can use the logic of dictatorial rule to give autocrats the right incentives to change their government for the better. We wonder, can we create a desire by at least some autocrats to govern for the people as the best way to ensure their own political survival? Debt reduction might work in democracies. Since such nations want to reduce the excessive debt anyway, debt reduction certainly clearly helps speed the process. But as can be seen in this figure, Mozambique was already tackling its debt problem prior to a large-scale forgiveness in 2001 and in 2006. Therefore, we advocate a conservative approach of little to no debt relief as a way to improve the quality of governance and the quality of life of people currently living under wretched, oppressive regimes. We know that debt relief allows autocrats to entrench themselves in office. Debt forgiveness with the promise of subsequent democratization never works. An autocrat might be sincere in his willingness to have meaningful elections in return for funds. Yet once the financial crisis is over and the leader can borrow to pay off the coalition, any promised election will be a sham. For Democrats, debt relief, while helpful, is unnecessary. By eliminating debt relief for autocrats, we can help precipitate the sorts of rebellions seen in the Middle East in 2011. Rebellions that, as discussed later, may very well open the door to better governments in the future. That's never gonna happen. Taxation, resource extraction, and borrowing are the foremost ways of acquiring funds for enriching a coalition. Discussions that portray taxation differently are either window dressing to make the process seem more palatable, or are making arguments based on how people would like the world to work. Leaders tax because they need to spend on their coalition. Successful leaders raise as much revenue as they can. The limits of taxation are 1. The willingness of people to work as they are taxed, 2. What the coalition is willing to bear, and 3. The cost of collecting taxes. Having filled government coffers, leaders spend resources in 3 ways. First, they provide public goods, that is, policies that benefit all. Second, they deliver private rewards to their coalition members. This mix of private and public benefits differs across political systems, and it's worth noting that any resources left over after paying off the coalition are discretionary. Leaders therefore have a third choice to make about spending money. They could spend discretionary money promoting their pet projects. Alternatively, and all too commonly, as we shall see, they can hide them in a rainy day fund. Let's see what else there was. I see. Okay, nothing too exciting on my end besides a couple of other things. And with that out of the way, I believe Kex is still playing. Let me double check on that one. just to be completely certain, but yeah, looks like Kix is currently still playing through Master Chief Collection, so we'll see whether he gets to this one or not. However, as promised, time to put on the ad break first. We'll see whether this one will be extra long or not. No, just 1 minute. I'll be back in a second and we'll move on to the next topic. Alright, that's an ad break done with. So now we can move on to the next topic at hand, which was the development of Halo Wars as detailed in Blood, Sweat and Pixels. Because right now I'm on my Halo streak and this should be an interesting read. I've already learned as to what happened during Diablo 3 development in the Blizzard book, so we'll see how that one goes a little later. But for now, let's put on the appropriate soundtrack. In the summer of 2004, Ensemble Studios' management team flew to Chicago for an off-site retreat that felt unusually somber. They were having what some would call an identity crisis. Ensemble had spent years working on prototypes for video games that just weren't making any of them happy, and they needed to get away for a few days and talk things through. "We said we should be doing what we're passionate about," said Chris Rippey, an Ensemble producer who was at the retreat. "Get back on track." The question was, what would that look like? Ensemble, based in Dallas, Texas, had been making the same type of video game for nearly 10 years. They'd built their reputation on Age of Empires, a cerebral game series in which you'd start off with a handful of villagers and gradually build an entire civilization. Like Blizzard's Warcraft and Westwood's Command & Conquer, Age of Empires was a real-time strategy game, or RTS, in which the action unfolded without turns or pauses. You'd progress through different technological eras, Stone Age, Bronze Age, as you harvested resources. And hey there, Kix, you're just in time. As you harvested resources, constructed buildings, and trained armies to conquer your opponents. To finish the first Age of Empires, Ensemble staff went through what Dave Pottinger, a lead designer, described as a terrible death march which could never be repeated today, working 100-hour weeks for nearly a year. When it finally came out in 1997, Age of Empires was an immediate hit, selling millions for Ensemble and its publisher Microsoft. This was followed by a glut of profitable Age sequels, expansions, and spin-offs, eventually leading Microsoft to buy Ensemble. By 2004, the studio was working on yet another game in the series, Age of Empires 3, which was due to come out at the end of 2005. What had always been unorthodox about Ensemble, and what ensured that people rarely left the studio, was that they saw themselves as a family. Since Ensemble's founding in 1995, the company had been made up of mostly young, single men who spent nights and weekends together. On any given Saturday night, a good chunk of the team was at someone's apartment, wrote Ian Fisher, a lead designer, in a magazine retrospective. You keep an eye on these folks, I'm gonna go lay down. Yeah, you go get some rest, Kix. In a magazine retrospective, which was Ian Fisher, Blast from the Past. Ensemble figures out how to go from empires to kings. Article at Game Sauce, Spring 2010. Friday after work, there'd be like a dozen people in the playtest area playing Quake, then Quake 2, then Half-Life, until 3 a.m. If you didn't actually share an apartment with the guy you sat next to, you were probably going to be having a beer at his place later that night. A bit quiet on the stream for me, then maybe I can move the microphone a little bit closer, like so. Even through the early 2000s, as Ensemble's co-founders grew up and started real families, they shared what they saw as an uncommon amount of chemistry. Every prospective employee had to go through a rigorous interview process that for a while included meetings with all 20-something people at the studio. If just one person said no, the prospective employee was out. It was really like a family, said Rich Geldreich, a graphics engineer. It was a combination family / a little bit of a frat house. During that summer of 2004, with Age of Empires 3 in the works, many of Ensemble's veterans grumbled that they were sick of making Age games. Some of them were tired of RTS games in general. They tried several times to get a second development team off the ground, one that would experiment with other genres, but that team always seemed to fail. Ensemble would fall into the same pattern every time. The second team would play around with prototypes and early concepts for a while, then the main Age team would invariably run into some sort of catastrophe, such as when they had to redo Age of Empire 2's entire design after a year because it wasn't fun to play. Ensemble's management would then ask the second team to put their own project on hold and come help with the latest Age game. Every time this happened, the second project would lose momentum and peter out like a steam engine that stopped getting coal. The pattern we fell into, starting with Age 2, was that we so overbid and underfinished the games that even though we tried to do other things, we ended up having to pull everybody in just to get the game finished, said Dave Pottinger. In previous years, Ensemble's second team had prototyped an RPG, a platformer, and several other experiments, all of which were discarded. Canceling prototypes wasn't an unusual practice for a game studio, but the pattern was becoming rough for Ensemble's staff, who wanted to show the world that they could expand beyond Age of Empires. That was why the management team was sitting in Chicago during the summer of 2004, trying to figure out their next move. Chris Rippey, Dave Pottinger, and the rest of Ensemble's managers evaluated their options. They had two projects in development. There was Age of Empires 3, their next flagship game, and then there was a car action game called Wrench that no one was particularly excited about. For 2 days they sat and debated. Did they really want to keep working on Wrench? Why were they still doing it? Inertia? Tons of other ideas kept resurfacing. What if they made a Diablo clone? What if they built a massively multiplayer online game, MMO that is? And what if they developed a real-time strategy game for consoles? For decades, the accepted wisdom had been that real-time strategy games would work only on a computer. Because of the genre's speed and complexity, the RTS was best suited to a mouse and keyboard, so a player could zoom around the map with one hand and type in orders on the other. Consoles didn't have mice and keyboards, they had controllers, whose joysticks and limited buttons proved ineffectual for fast-paced multitasking. For as long as RTS games had existed, nobody had been able to solve this problem. Zealots of PC gaming would point to StarCraft 64, a subpar port of Blizzard's StarCraft that didn't capture the nuances of its PC counterpart, as evidence that an RTS simply couldn't work on a console. Angelo Lawton, a veteran programmer and member of the Ensemble management team, had always believed otherwise. Like most engineers, Lawton relished the act of solving impossible problems, and he thought a console RTS made for one hell of a challenge. Angelo was fired up about it, said Chris Rippey. We had some loose ideas on how to make it work. During the meetings in Chicago, both Lawton and Rippey pushed hard for a console RTS, arguing that it was the perfect opportunity for Ensemble. They had talent and experience. Gamers respected them as RTS developers, and their parent company, Microsoft, was months away from launching the much-anticipated Xbox 360, a powerful new machine that could be home to the first great RTS on consoles. This plan would allow Dave Pottinger and others on the team, who were sick of making RTS games, to work on other projects. For years, Ensemble's CEO Tony Goodman had wanted to make an MMO along the lines of Blizzard's World of Warcraft, which was due to come out a few months later, in November 2004. Nearly everyone at Ensemble was playing the beta. The thought of developing a big multiplayer game was polarizing at the studio, but Goodman and some of the other veterans, like Ian Fisher, had always wanted to make it happen. By the end of the Chicago trip, Ensemble's management had greenlit 3 new projects. First was the console RTS, which they gave the codename Phoenix. Second was the MMO, codenamed Titan. What a cursed name. The third game, codenamed Nova, would be a sci-fi action RPG and Diablo clone led by Pottinger, once he and his team had finished work on Age of Empires 3. If Blizzard could juggle StarCraft, World of Warcraft and Diablo, the managers thought, why couldn't Ensemble do something comparable? When the management team got back to Dallas, they announced that they were canceling Wrench and starting these other, more exciting projects. On Phoenix, Angelo Loren would be the lead programmer, Chris Rippey would be the producer, and to figure out what the game would feel like to play, they brought in one of their most experienced developers, a designer named Graham Devine. Devine, a Scottish expatriate who with long hair and a high-pitched laugh, had one of the most eclectic resumes in gaming. As a teenager in the 1980s, he'd done programming work for Atari, Lucasfilm Games, and Activision. Before he turned 30, Devine had founded his own company, Trilobite, and designed a smash hit called The Seventh Guest that had blended tricky puzzles with cinematic storytelling. After falling out with his Trilobite co-founder and watching the studio collapse, Devine went to id Software to work alongside one of his old friends, the legendary programmer John Carmack. He spent 4 years helping develop games like Quake 3 and Doom 3 before leaving for Ensemble in 2003, where he was put in charge of coding pathing algorithms, the mathematical formulas that told units how to move, for Age of Empires 3. In hindsight, this felt like an odd choice for the management team. Devine had a legendary brain for game design and storytelling. Why did they have him teaching Age of Empires units how to walk around? Recalled Devine. Dave Pottinger called me up and said, "Hey, we're not really using you properly at Ensemble. We'd really like you to try to break this RTS and console thing. How'd you like to head up a team to try and get RTS on a console?" "Sure," Devine told Pottinger. When would they start? The Phoenix team was now Graham Devine, Angelo Loren, and Chris Rippey, as well as a few other artists and programmers. It was a small, close-knit group whose members were excited to work on something that wasn't Age of Empires. "Our team of misfits," Devine liked to say. It didn't take long before they had a basic concept in place. Phoenix would be a sci-fi game in which humans battled against aliens, sort of like StarCraft. Playing as the humans would feel drastically different from playing as the alien race, which Devine called the Sway. The goal was to evoke War of the Worlds, pitting hulking alien war machines against the scrappy armies of mankind. The ideas were the easy part. Far harder, Devine knew, would be figuring out the controls. Most video games, when they first enter development, already have a set of controller conventions they can follow. You know that if you pick up a first-person shooter, the right trigger is going to fire shots, and the left trigger is going to aim. The left joystick will always control the character's movement, while the right joystick rotates the camera. Designers working on big series like Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed might make small tweaks to the core formula, but they don't have to rethink the controls every time they start developing a new game. Phoenix didn't have that luxury. The main reason real-time strategy games had never done well on consoles was that there had never been a great control scheme. Right away, Devine and the team had to start asking fundamental questions that most games would have already solved. How would you move around the screen? Would you control a cursor as you would in Age of Empires and use that to select units and give them actions? Or would you control units directly? Would you be able to select multiple units at once? How would you construct buildings? Answering these questions would be impossible without testing all the possibilities, so Devine and his team spent months experimenting. "We were burning through tons and tons of prototypes," said Colt McCandless, who had been hired as a graphics engineer for Phoenix. How to move the camera, how that works, moving the camera and grabbing units, how not to make people nauseous in the process. It was a lot of groundbreaking R&D. They cranked through hundreds of different control schemes. They played games like Pikmin and Aliens vs Predator Extinction, both console games with RTS elements, and tried to pinpoint what worked. "We started incorporating all of their ideas and skipping the stuff we didn't care for," said Chris Rippey. "All of these games did something really smart and really cool, and we just kind of put them all together into one package." Every week, usually every day, they'd hold mandatory playtesting sessions where the small Phoenix team would sit down and play through the prototypes they'd developed that week. It was a rigorous, focused process that led them to throw out a whole lot of work. The feedback system at Ensemble was brutal, it was honest, but it forged a good game, said Devine. From there, they came up with a few control schemes that seemed to feel satisfying, like an area select option that would let you take command of a group of units by holding down the A button. Now they just needed corporate approval. Although Microsoft gave Ensemble the freedom to pursue prototypes like Phoenix and the other second-team games they'd cancelled over the years, those games couldn't move forward until they got an okay from Ensemble's parent company. Until the bosses in Redmond gave the green light to Phoenix, it would remain in purgatory, unable to enter full production or hire new staff. When Xbox executives came down to visit, the Phoenix team showed them their prototypes. Microsoft seemed happy with what they saw, telling Ensemble to keep up the good work. Toward the end of 2005, as the rest of the studio prepared to ship Age of Empires 3, the Phoenix team kept plugging away, buoyed by the fact that they'd finally made a non-Age game that Microsoft cared about. Members of the Age of Empires 3 team, busy working late nights to finish their game, were far less thrilled. This was an interesting period for Ensemble because it was the second game that Microsoft got excited about, said Dave Pottinger, who was the lead designer on Age of Empires 3. And unfortunately, for us, it was an RTS, because we had tried for so long not to make an RTS. We didn't want to get pigeonholed into just the RTS company, but of course that's exactly what Microsoft wanted. That's what we were good at, that's why they had bought us, and that's what they wanted us to do. Microsoft hadn't greenlit any of Ensemble's previous prototypes, but its representatives had really liked Phoenix. Executives on the Xbox team, who were later laser-focused on beating Sony's PlayStation 3 in the so-called console war, loved the idea of getting one of their flagship studios on the new Xbox 360. What they didn't love was this was a new IP. In Microsoft's eyes, this sort of brand new franchise would be hard to market properly. Real-time strategy games were a tough enough sell in the first place, often performing far worse in the market than the first-person shooters Microsoft loved making. Without some sort of established brand attached to Phoenix, Microsoft's executives feared that the game wouldn't move enough copies to justify their investment. For Ensemble, getting a game greenlit meant progressing through a series of meetings with Xbox executives like Phil Spencer and Peter Moore, which is what the Phoenix team had to do. During the first meeting, things went smoothly. But when Graham Devine and his team met with Microsoft for the second green light meeting, Microsoft gave them a new mandate. Make it a Halo game. Halo was incredibly hot at the time, said Peter Moore. The first two games had sold millions of copies, and Halo 3, coming in 2007, was one of the most anticipated games ever. We felt that Halo was IP that lent itself well to a real-time strategy game, given the way that this universe was constructed. Good guys versus bad guys. All the stuff you needed in an RTS. And I think that probably the data and the evidence lent towards a lower risk opportunity in Halo than a new IP. This sort of move isn't uncommon in the video game industry, where publishers tend to be conservative and risk-averse, leaning towards established franchises and sequels whenever possible. Even the most ambitious game studios sometimes rejigger their games to incorporate familiar franchises. Yet for Devine and his development team, who had spent nearly a year working on this project, telling them to change it to a more marketable IP was like telling a new mother to go swap her infant for a better-looking one. Over lengthy, heated discussions, Microsoft's executives explained that if Ensemble wanted to make its console RTS, it would have to be based on Halo. End of story. It was basically put as either you make this Halo, or you're all going to get laid off. Devine was shattered. He'd spent months creating and cultivating Phoenix's world and characters, and he thought they were just as important to the game as anything else they'd done. It wasn't just the console RTS, it was his own unique creation. When you're knee-deep in making your own IP, you love it, Devine said. You really do. You love it. It's yours and it's fantastic. He also realized that substituting Phoenix's lore for Halo characters would have all sorts of logistical consequences. They'd have to scrap most of the work they'd done so far. When you're presented with making Halo, you try to explain it's not just a matter of calling these aliens the Covenant and these humans the UNSC. It's actually a huge change that I don't think came across very loud and clear. I think Microsoft felt that it was just a color change, a graphical change. I don't remember it being 100% surprised, said Chris Rippey. I'm sure it was way more painful for Graham because he put blood, sweat, and tears into that design, and he's a passionate guy too, so I know it was more painful for him. Heartbroken, Devine considered quitting Ensemble. He sat at his computer and started up Google. What was this whole Halo thing about anyway? It was huge, sure, but why did people care about it? Were they just into shooting aliens' heads off? Or was there some sort of hidden depth that Devine didn't know about? As he read more and more about Halo lore, from the superpowered hero Master Chief to the complex alien empire known as the Covenant, Devine started to realize it might be the latter. My view of it Friday night was that it was a bunch of purple aliens that moved really fast in front of you and you shot them, Devine said. My view Monday morning was, boy, they put a lot of thought into this across a lot of years. Maybe there is something more to it than I thought. With that, Devine and crew made their decision. Phoenix would become Halo Wars. Goodbye, Sway. Hello, Master Chief. except they weren't allowed to use Master Chief. Bungie, the studio behind Halo, didn't want this team of strangers in Texas messing around with their iconic lead character. Bungie and Ensemble were sister studios, but Bungie was the older, more popular sister, the one who got all of Mom and Dad's attention. Age of Empires was big, but compared with Halo, it had the cultural impact of a brunch photo on Instagram. In 2005, Bungie's first-person shooter series was one of the biggest things on the planet. A few days later, the Phoenix leads flew up to Seattle to visit Bungie. First, they met with the studio's top leaders. They sat down with Joe Staten, the longtime writer of Halo, to talk about the lore and story. They geeked out about control schemes with Jamie Greisemer, Halo's design lead. Later, they addressed the rest of Bungie's staff in a conference room. As Chris Rippey and Graham Devine stood in front of the makers of Halo and talked about their exciting new project, they were greeted by nothing but blank stares. We told them that we were going to be making a Halo RTS, and I don't think any of them had any idea or any warning that this meeting was going to happen, said Rippey. And if you know the Bungie guys, they're very protective of their stuff, so I think we shocked them. I wouldn't say that it was hostile, but the reception was cold. And it's not their fault. If somebody had come to us and said, "Hey, we're making this Age of Empires action game," we'd probably have the same reaction if we didn't know what was going on. To mitigate this tension, Devine and Rippey did what they did best. They played video games. Just a few minutes after telling Bungie's staff about Halo Wars, Devine set them all up with an early build of Phoenix to prove that they'd made a console RTS that felt good to play. By the time they had processed a little of the shock, they were already in front of the game playing it, said Rippey. That helped a lot. It also helped that Devine was eager to absorb as much Halo lore as humanly possible. Everything Joe Staten said, Devine gobbled up, no matter how esoteric or granular it got. By the end of the visit, Devine wanted to be able to explain, in detail, the difference between a San'Shyun and a Sangheili. The San'Shyun, of course, are the prophetic leaders of the Covenant, while the Sangheili are a race of Saurian warriors, aka the Prophets and the Elites. When Halo Wars team landed back in Dallas, they scrapped just about everything they'd done. They kept the control scheme and the user interface, but all the other ideas they put into the Phoenix project would be useless for a Halo game. The team began drawing up new design ideas, story beats, and concept art for Halo Wars, knowing that they were essentially starting from scratch. Because Bungie maintained ownership over all things Halo, Ensemble would have to get Bungie's approval on even the most basic story ideas, which could be a bureaucratic process. Ensemble decided that they wanted the game to revolve around a group of United Nations Space Command, UNSC, soldiers on a ship called the Spirit of Fire, and that the bulk of combat would take place on the planet Arcadia, which the team had invented just for Halo Wars. All these decisions had to go through Bungie. Recognizing that it might help to be charming, Graham Devine designed a fictional travel pamphlet for Arcadia and showed it to Joe Staten, who was responsible for the series' lore at Bungie. I said, "I'm at a new planet. Please, can I add this? Here's a travel brochure for it," Devine said. Staten was amused by Devine's quirky pitches, and in the coming months, Devine would fly up to Seattle every few weeks to collaborate with Bungie on Halo Wars' story. "I think in the beginning they were really worried," said Devine, "but after a while they started to really trust me." Yet the Halo Wars team always felt like they were a couple of steps behind. It was difficult to tell a story in the Halo universe when the Halo universe existed mostly in the heads of a bunch of people who lived 2,000 miles away. And besides, Bungie had its own project to deal with, the secretive Halo 3. "We ran into problems with what they were willing to show us and tell us on Halo 3, which made things difficult," said Chris Rippey. "They were working after their story and what they were doing. They were looking after their story and what they were doing. They were being pretty protective, so that led to some gaps in our knowledge of that we would have to work around." The truth was, a large chunk of Bungie's leadership was never happy about Halo Wars, according to several people who used to work at both companies. Bungie tolerated Ensemble's questions as cordially as they could. They got a kick out of the whimsical Graham Devine, and Joe Staten was always classy. But in private, Bungie's staffers would gripe that they didn't want another studio touching Halo. When Ensemble was sent over questions or asked for permission to use certain parts of the lore, Bungie would sometimes stonewall them. In a 2012 interview with the website gamesindustry.biz, Ensemble's boss, Tony Goodman, went public about their strained relationship. Bungie was kind of sore about the idea, he told the site. What they called it was the whoring out of the franchise or something. Tension between the two studios only exacerbated Ensemble's other problems. Development on Halo Wars was not going smoothly, and by some estimates, the switch to Halo had set the team's progress back months. They were happy with their control scheme. Designers at Ensemble were convinced they'd finally cracked the console RTS code, but conceptualizing and building the world of Halo Wars took far more time than they thought it would. By the middle of 2006, Microsoft had officially greenlit Halo Wars, which meant that Ensemble's management could staff up the project and start producing the art and code they'd need to get it out of the door. Now they'd have to confront the problem that has popped up a few months earlier. Outside of Graham Devine, Chris Rippey, Angelo Lauren, and the rest of their small team, nobody else at Ensemble really wanted to work on Halo Wars. After a decade of nothing but Age of Empires and its spin-offs, the studio's veterans were sick of RTS games. Given the choice, many of them had flocked to the nascent MMO project in hopes of channeling their own World of Warcraft obsessions into a big hit of their own. Others had moved to Dave Pottinger's sci-fi Diablo, Nova. Nobody at Ensemble could agree on what to do next, so they all just did different things. Employees would joke that their studio's name had become an ironic punchline. These days they didn't feel like much of a family at all. Theoretically, most of their resources should have been funneled into Halo Wars because their parents at Microsoft hadn't greenlit any of the other prototypes, but the studio had become fractured and cliquish. The Age of Empires 3 team didn't want to move to Halo Wars, and even as the Halo Wars team needed to staff up, some of them didn't want the Age guys on their turf either. "We were fine with it," said Colt McCandless, the Halo Wars engineer. "It was a lot of politics internal to Ensemble. We were like, fine, you guys move there and leave us alone." The Halo Wars team, which mostly consisted of younger, less experienced Ensemble staff, saw the veterans as arrogant and difficult to work with. "When they made a decision, they would put the hammer down," said McCandless. "There wasn't a discussion, there wasn't an evaluation, it was just like, no, we're doing it this way. If you don't like it, get out." Elsewhere at Ensemble, there was a perception that Halo Wars was just something they had to do to please Microsoft, like when a Hollywood actor shoots a superhero movie so he has the leverage to film his passion project about climate change. Most of Ensemble's veterans wanted to make other games. At one point, the studio's leadership decided that the big MMO wouldn't take place in a brand new sci-fi world as had been originally planned. During an all-hands meeting, Ensemble's management announced that actually they were going to make it a Halo MMO. Ian Fisher got on stage and said, "We've chosen an IP and it's going to be Halo," said Graham Devine. What raised some eyebrows and what portended bad news for Ensemble was they hadn't gotten official approval from Microsoft to make this decision. "We realized that Microsoft wouldn't plunk that kind of money down on an unproven IP," said Dave Pottinger. "The idea to use Halo IP was created in a way to get the game made. So yeah, we didn't exactly ask permission, though they knew. We knew it was going to be a risky choice." From the outside, this all might have seemed insane. Fewer than 100 people worked at Ensemble, yet the studio was simultaneously trying to develop 3 different games, including an MMO, which itself would require a staff in the dozens. World of Warcraft, which set the bar that Ensemble aspired to reach, had a team of 50 to 60 when it launched in 2004, according to a Blizzard spokesperson. The studio couldn't expand without getting approval from Microsoft, and Microsoft seemed to have no interest in greenlighting any of Ensemble's other prototypes, including the Halo MMO. But Ensemble kept working on all 3 games nonetheless. At one point we had a sci-fi RTS on a console, we had a sci-fi MMO, and we had a sci-fi Diablo, all 3 of which were different, said Dave Pottinger. In the most negative view, it was a testament to how much we weren't getting along at that point. As a result, the Halo Wars team remained understaffed. "For the longest time," said Rich Geldreich, "I would wonder why we only had roughly 25-ish people total on the project, when it's our next big major game and there were all these prototypes going on." What Halo Wars really needed was more programmers, especially ones who knew how to handle the trickier aspects of RTS development, like simulating artificial intelligence. In a real-time strategy game, the computer just makes thousands of tiny decisions every second, quietly calculating when to construct buildings and move phalanxes of units around the map. For inexperienced programmers, this was a difficult task to handle. Imagine you've got a game world consisting of hundreds of entities, and they all have to pathfind and make decisions in real time, or seemingly in real time, said Geldreich. There's AI involved in that. When you give them commands, they are really high-level commands like go there, or attack there, or stop, or something. They have to figure out how to pathfind from A to B, and that can be very complex. Imagine if, as a unit in pathfinding from A to B, a building blows up, or a new route is created because a bunch of trees are cut down. It's a very dynamic problem. Add online multiplayer to the equation, where a laggy connection would desync 2 computers and throw all the simulations off, and you've got all sorts of potential for a broken video game. It didn't help that instead of putting the technology they developed for the Age games, the Halo Wars team had started from scratch with a brand new engine that could take advantage of the Xbox 360's unique computing power. Pathfinding was always a difficult problem in an RTS, but we had invested probably close to 20 man-years in pathing at that point, said Dave Pottinger. The Halo Wars team threw it all away and started over. Despite these hiccups, Microsoft was gung-ho about Ensemble's game. On September 26th and 27th, 2006, the publisher revealed Halo Wars to the world, showcasing the game with an intense CGI trailer that depicted a war between the human Spartans and their alien opponents. At one point, Ensemble had scheduled the game to be finished by the end of 2007, and perhaps that's what Microsoft was expecting then, though scrutiny of the studio might have made it clear that it wasn't going to happen. Graham Devine and his team of misfits were enjoying themselves, but the Halo Wars team was short-handed and too far behind in key areas. One day, frustrated that the art team wasn't properly capturing the Halo aesthetics, Rich Geldreich printed out 400 full-color screenshots from Halo games to hand on the walls. I plastered them everywhere in the studio, he said. In the bathrooms, in the kitchen, the hallways, the meeting rooms, because I was pissed off that this game didn't look like a Halo game. Other teams weren't faring much better. After nearly a year's worth of work, Dave Pottinger's Diablo prototype, Nova, got cancelled. Microsoft chose to instead greenlit a promising action RPG from a different studio called Too Human. This may have been the wrong call. Too Human, released by the developer Silicon Knights in 2008, was poorly received by fans and critics. In 2012, following a long legal battle, a jury ruled that Silicon Knights had breached its licensing agreement with the maker of the Unreal Engine, Epic Games, while working on games like Too Human. In addition to paying hefty damages, Silicon Knights had to recall unsold copies of Too Human and even pull the game from Xbox 360's digital store. Other teams... For a few months, Pottinger and a small team worked on another prototype, a spy Zelda game called Agent, but he couldn't get the headcount he needed to finish it, and soon enough he had moved to Halo Wars. Pottinger's team split up. Many of the artists went to the MMO, while the programmers joined him on Halo Wars, which desperately needed the coding help. In early 2007, Graham Devine and his crew started working on a Halo Wars demo for E3, where they hoped to quash fans' skepticism that Halo would never work as a real-time strategy game. By the time the show came around, they created a slick 10-minute video narrated by Devine that demonstrated a series of battles between UNSC Marines and the nasty alien Covenant. In the demo, the player built two Warthogs, Halo's iconic armored pickup trucks, and had them leap over a crevasse near his base. Warthogs can gain strategic control of areas of the map that other vehicles can't get to, Devine explained in the video. Fans were hyped, which energized the developers at Ensemble. That was a really sexy demo, and we came away from E3 that year really excited about the game, said Dave Pottinger. The reception was good. Graham was the perfect showman and said all the right things about loving the IP, and he really did love the IP. We got people excited about somebody who was good at making RTSs and cared about Halo was going to go make the perfect marriage between the two. But as work on the project continued, it remained clear that Halo Wars was in trouble. In the months following E3 2007, two major problems emerged. One was that the Halo Wars team remained understaffed. Many of Ensemble's veterans were still working on the Halo MMO, which still hadn't been greenlit but was taking up a great deal of the studio's resources. The second problem was that the design was constantly changing. As a result of Ensemble's various prototype cancellations and internal politics, there were several experienced lead designers on the Halo Wars team by the end of 2007, including both Graham Devine and Dave Pottinger. Devine, who had been leading design since the Phoenix days back in 2005, had a specific vision in mind for the game, while Pottinger, the senior Age designer who had just joined the project a few months earlier, had other ideas in mind. But an orchestra needs only one conductor, and the Halo Wars team spent a great deal of time getting into fights. Not yelling fights, but loud fights, Devine said. It's funny, it's always around game things. Should the economy be cheaper, or should the economy be more expensive? Should bases be freestanding, or bases all be connected together? It's all good stuff. It's not, oh my gosh, your t-shirt is terrible. It's all just awesome stuff that makes a game much better, but at the time, it's highly stressful. One of the biggest fights centered on what Devine called the Rule of 8, a guideline that the Halo Wars team had been following since back in the Phoenix days. What that meant was that the player could select only 8 units at once, to ensure that the gameplay didn't feel too clunky and complicated on a controller. Some of the designers began to question this rule, arguing that it was making Halo Wars too simple. Divine pushed back. When you play a test every single day, you get very good at the controls, and you forget that you had to learn them at one point. And so all of a sudden you think, well, 10 of these would be perfectly easy. 16 even. It's a common dilemma in game development. When you're working on the same game for years, you inevitably get bored. It's tempting to make changes just for the sake of making changes, to spice things up because you're sick of using the same simple control scheme when you get into work every day. For Halo Wars, that became a constant point of tension. Divine and his team had intentionally made this game simpler than its RTS counterparts on the PC because the console controls would be so unfamiliar to people. And now some people were trying to make it more complicated. "We were trying to avoid layers of thinking," said Chris Rippey. "One of the biggest problems with long game development is, when you play test the game for too long, you invent problems and you add layers to the game that don't need to be added." Although they had impressed fans with what Divine narrated demo in 2007, E3 2007, the Halo Wars team was in a sad state. They'd scripted the demo entirely by hand with code that wouldn't work in the final game. Sure, the graphics were running in real time, but the artificial intelligence wasn't properly hooked up, and playing an actual match of Halo Wars wasn't nearly as satisfying as the demo made it look. In Dave Pottinger's eyes, Halo Wars needed to go in a totally new direction. "We didn't have a game that was fun," said Pottinger. "It didn't work. The E3 demo was a pretty kick-ass demo, but not something that was representative of the gameplay. It was just entirely built for E3. In the months that followed, the Halo Wars team continued to argue over the game's basic features. Were the units on the screen too small? Why was base building so complicated? Should they have control groups that would allow players to assign hotkeys to different squads of units, as in StarCraft and other RTS games?" After all the squabbling, something had to give. That something turned out to be Graham Devine. "When lead designers are fighting, it's not good," Devine said. "So I had one meeting where I said, 'Dave, you take the lead design position. I'm having a lot of fun in the story. I'm just going to stick to the story.'" Devine remained the face of the game, showing it off at Microsoft marketing meetings and press events, and Dave Pottinger, who for years had resisted working on another RTS game, became the lead designer of Halo Wars. Right away, Pottinger made big changes to the core mechanics of Halo Wars. "We basically threw out the design and started over." He altered almost all of the units, including the leaping warthogs they'd shown at E3, which weren't quite working out. Warthogs would remain in Halo Wars, but they would no longer have the ability to jump gaps. He ditched the sprawling base building system, replacing it with prefabricated bases that each held a finite number of slots. He overhauled the resource system, reducing the amount of time players would have to spend managing their economy. And he added a select all button, which the team had resisted for a long time. With Halo Wars scheduled for release in just a few months, Pottinger threw out nearly all of Divine's design work. "I took over the design, and Graham kept doing the story stuff, which was a full-time job, and he did a great job at that." At the same time, Ensemble's other team was also dealing with turmoil. For years now, a large chunk of the studio had been working on their dream project, the Halo MMO. The MMO wasn't exactly a secret. Microsoft knew that Ensemble wanted to make its own version of World of Warcraft, but Microsoft still hadn't given it the green light either. To some on the Xbox team, it was a surprise to find out that Ensemble had dedicated so many staff to the Halo MMO when the studio should have ostensibly been focusing on Halo Wars. It was very common for people to show up and go, "What the fuck is this? Why are you working on that?" said Colt McCandless. "I remember where there were some key meetings I was in where people were like, 'We didn't know you guys were putting resources on this. We thought these resources were over there.'" Others dispute this, saying that Microsoft's management was well aware of how many people Ensemble had on the MMO. Soon enough, an axe came down. Microsoft made it clear to Ensemble's leadership that it had no interest in spending tens of millions on an MMO, and the project was unceremoniously cancelled. "We made trade-offs," said Pottinger. "Part of why we did Halo Wars was to give us a chance to do the MMO. I think unfortunately the MMO was going to be a huge thing, and Microsoft decided that it wasn't going to be something they wanted us to do. Some members of the MMO team split off and worked on new prototypes for a while, including a potential Age of Empires 4, while others moved over to Halo Wars." You're talking about the Halo MMO? Well, officially, as you can see, it never left the drawing board. All of this drama was undoubtedly raising eyebrows at Microsoft. Ever since the original Age of Empires in 1997, there had been bouts of tension between Ensemble and its publisher. As long as Ensemble was shipping games and generating profits, those tensions would ultimately fizzle. But Ensemble hadn't released a new game since Age of Empires 3 over 2 years earlier, in 2005. All this talk about an MMO had frustrated Microsoft's executives, who were scaling back on PC gaming in favor of the red-hot Xbox 360. The Halo MMO, unlike Halo Wars, was designed for PCs. Keeping Ensemble's 100-plus staff on the payroll was starting to seem like a bad investment. Contrary to popular belief, headcount's not completely free at Microsoft, said Shane Kim, who was a vice president in the Xbox division. The matter of fact was it was a sort of zero-sum, a lot of headcount. They're very expensive, and we decided we needed to deploy that in other areas. Unlike most game developers, Colt McCandless enjoyed getting to work at 6 a.m. His co-workers wouldn't typically arrive for another 4 or 5 hours, and he felt most productive when he was coding by himself, with nobody around to distract him. McCandless was responsible for some of the most complicated engineering work on Halo Wars. Art tools, light shaders, multicore threading processes. Solitude helped. One Monday in September 2008, McCandless arrived at the office at his usual time. It didn't take long for him to realize that something was off. Instead of empty desks, he found dozens of his co-workers mulling around. "Wait, what the hell was going on?" he said. "What are you all doing here?" Nobody would give him a straight answer until a few hours later, when a co-worker mentioned that a bunch of Microsoft bigwigs were coming to visit. Word got around that everyone at Ensemble needed to go to the auditorium for an all-hands meeting. As they filed in, they started seeing scores of Microsoft employees, HR people, vice presidents, executives. When the whole company had gotten settled, Ensemble's CEO, Tony Goodman, stood up front and dropped a nuclear bomb. Tony gets on stage and says, "We have some news," said Graham Devine. "Ensemble is going to be closing after Halo Wars." After 14 years and a dozen games, Ensemble's time was coming to an end. The good news, Goodman said, was that Microsoft wanted them to finish Halo Wars. Everyone at Ensemble would keep his or her job for another 4 months or so, which would give people a fair amount of time to look for new gigs. "Microsoft wanted to talk to us about keeping us all on through the end of Halo Wars," said Devine. And Tony hands it over to Microsoft to explain exactly how they were going to do that, because we'd all just gotten the news that we have no jobs after we ship this game. For 2 hours, Microsoft representatives, including VP Shane Kim, stood in front of the room and answered questions from hurt Ensemble employees. "They're going, 'Why us?' said Kim. 'You've got Rare, you've got Lionhead. Surely there must be other places you can cut instead of us.' Unfortunately, it's one of the darker sides of the job." Kim tried to be diplomatic, adding that Microsoft would be giving solid severance packages to those Ensemble staff who stayed until Halo Wars was out the door. Some people started crying. Others got angry. "I flipped the fuck out," said Colt McCandless. "My wife and I had just gotten pregnant for the very first time, and our baby was due at the end of January, which was supposed to be the exact date the company was supposed to close. We had a newborn that was supposed to be delivered the day I was no longer supposed to have a job." Two people, the brothers Paul and David Bettner, immediately quit Ensemble and started their own studio, New Toy, which went on to make the popular Scrabble clone, Words with Friends. One might say their move worked out nicely. In 2010, Zynga purchased New Toy for $53.3 million. Rich Geldreich, the graphics engineer, also left the studio shortly after hearing about the shutdown. "My brain had cracked in two. I went crazy. I just couldn't handle the fact that Ensemble imploded. It was such an awesome company. I had 5 years invested in that company, and all that technology and coding and everything, and it was all just gone. And everybody was cracking around me. We were all going crazy. It was ridiculous." Soon afterward, Geldreich took a job at Valve. Those who remained at Ensemble found themselves in another uncomfortable situation. It wasn't that they'd been out of jobs in a few months. It was that some of them wouldn't be out of jobs. Tony Goodman informed everyone that he'd negotiated a contract with Microsoft as part of the closure. With this deal, he told the team, he'd be able to start an independent new studio, which he was calling Robot Entertainment. The Microsoft's contract would allow them to make an online version of Age of Empires as they tried to get their business going. The problem was, Goodman had secured only enough money to hire less than half of Ensemble's current staff, and only a few people knew exactly who had made the cut. "People all of a sudden were jockeying for new jobs," said McCandless. It was madness for a while because none of us really knew what was going on. There was always this water cooler chat. Hey, did they talk to you? No, they didn't talk to you? Well, if they offered you a job, would you accept it? Those who were invited to join Robot found out quickly, but to those who weren't getting spots, the following days were miserable. At one point, to clear the air, a manager tacked a piece of paper to the wall with a full list of ensemble employees who would be going to Robot. Dozens of people came crowding around to see who'd made the cut. It was like that scene in all the movies when the teacher comes out, said McCandless. Here's who's been accepted into the cheerleading squad, and everybody rushes to the board. To many at Ensemble, this new layer of politics was making a bad situation even worse. In our view, we saved half the jobs, said Pottinger. Whoever wasn't offered a spot at Robot, we screwed half the company over. I think we tried to do our best. We made mistakes. Other than Rich Geldreich and the Bettner brothers, everyone remained at Ensemble, despite the chaos. The severance packages helped. And over the next few months, Ensembles tried to put aside politics, and the fact that their studio would be shutting down, to finish Halo Wars. The motivation was to go out on as good a note as we could, said Pottinger. Ensemble staff wound up crunching for months, sleeping at their desks up until the very last minute to finish Halo Wars by the end of January, when they knew they'd all have to leave. The thing I'm not most proud of at the end was, when we announced the closure, the next day, 3 people left, said Pottinger. Every single other person stayed to finish the game. We were a dead man walking, said Devine. It was pretty crazy. In early 2009, Microsoft flew Devine around the world on a press tour. Traveling alongside the polarizing British designer Peter Molyneux, who was about to release the RPG Fable 2, Devine conducted interviews and showed off demos of Halo Wars. When journalists asked him about Ensemble's closure, he dodged their questions. I remember pieces of paper being put in front of me by Microsoft telling me, this is what you can say, Devine said. For those surreal final months, Ensemble staff tried to put their internal politics aside, coming together in hopes of releasing something they could all take pride in having made. Even though they all knew the studio was closing, they kept coming into work every day. They kept crunching, and they kept doing everything they could to make Halo Wars as good as possible. There were great days like nothing had ever happened and nothing was happening, and then there were depressing days, said Grippy. But it was a prideful group, and everybody wanted to do a great job, and everybody knew this was kind of the studio's legacy and wanted to do something to represent the studio properly. On February 26, 2009, Halo Wars came out. It was received fairly well, getting solid reviews from gaming sites like Eurogamer and IGN. When they look back, those who were on the Halo Wars team say they're proud to have released even a half-decent game after what they went through. Microsoft even hired a new developer, Creative Assembly, to make a sequel, Halo Wars 2, which came out in February 2017. A few studios rose from the ashes of Ensemble. There was Robot Entertainment, which went on to make Age of Empires Online, and then a popular tower defense series called Orcs Must Die. A different faction of ex-Ensemble developers started a company called Bonfire, which was also purchased by Zynga, then shut down in 2013. Not to be confused with the other video game studio named Bonfire, which Blizzard's Josh Mosqueira co-founded in 2016. Those developers later founded yet another studio, Boss Fight Entertainment. Nearly a decade after Ensemble's closure, many of its former employees are still working together. They were a family, after all. We hated each other, but we loved each other too, said Pottinger. Ensemble's lost very few people over its run compared to any other studio. You don't have a turnover rate of... it was less than 4% or something like that. You don't have that if you don't make people happy. Back at E3 2008, just a few months before Ensemble closed its doors for good, Halo Wars team puts out a cinematic trailer that may have, in retrospect, been a subconscious cry for help. Which, you know what? I think I'm going to put on right now. You know, of course, which one they're talking about, but still wouldn't hurt to look at it. Let's change the scenery over to this one. And there we go. Now looks like that's not exactly the trailer I had in mind, so let's add a number 2 to this one, and it should be, yep, this one. No, that's Halo Wars 2, so we wind that back a little bit. This one.
That's how long it took us to get Harvest back. At first it was going well, then setback after setback. Loss after loss. Made what was going to be a quick and decisive win into 5 years of hell.
You can certainly say that they put their best into this one. Or rather, their soul into this. That's what I was going to say. At any rate, I believe it's time for me to finish up for the night. Yeah, that really was 5 years of hell. For now, of course, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'll see you all tomorrow when we go back to Mechanicus. Thank you for coming, and until next time.